Okay, let's begin again. Conclude.
So here's what I'm getting. There is something about Black subculture in America today that holds African Americans themselves back.
Yes. In fact, I went into this in a previous book on which about black rednecks and white liberals, because that same subculture.
Let's talk about two of your books here. Go ahead.
Because that very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.
Okay, well, let's stop sharing. So anyway, that's a discussion about race, which I think impacts all of us in Texas: Native American, Asian American, African American, Anglo American, Latino, and has some, I think, some profound comments on the implications of racial and ethnic diversity mentioned on page 15. Because of our changing demographics, these are some of the political issues that come up, and the things that guide our public policies. Now, with the ascendance of Democrats over Republicans, we're going to see a lot more multicultural programming in the universities, like the University of Texas and Texas A&M. And so you'll see these classes offered at the universities, which promote these kinds of ideas. Well, as I said before the first break, we're going to get into the political implications of Texas's size in both geography and population, along with the geographic distribution of the residents. So what I'll do is I'll jump over to the PowerPoint and pick it up where we left off. At that point in time, we did leave off with this slide. So let me screen share that. And we'll get started. So on this slide, we're going to talk about the land and population distribution, political geography, social media, and the size. Now, Texas, as you know, is very large, 267,000 square miles, second only to Alaska with 570,000 miles. And we are as big as Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. We have 80,000 miles of major highways, 9,000 traffic signals, 900 dynamics message signs, programs to prevent and respond to accidents, damage to roads and bridges. So this massive size has an impact on our political campaigns as well. Running for office, of course, especially statewide office, that requires a significant investment of financial resources. Social media, the rise of social media as an inexpensive and effective means of getting out to people still is expensive and requires extensive fundraising. Now, we have grown over the last 175 years in terms of population, and we've grown more rapidly than the overall population of the United States. And we've increased according to the census. Now, this book is a little dated, and I apologize for that, but on page 17, according to the federal census, we estimate our population at 27 million. I'm sure that's gone up to 28 million in 2020, maybe even higher. That's a 32% increase from 2000. The population of California, of course, is the number one. It's well over 40 by now, and the states around us, Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, are 2 to 4 million. You can see these other big states, Florida, New York, which have a lot of representation in Congress, and we're number two. We have the second most representatives in Congress, and of course, all the states have the equal representation in the Senate. Now, although many people in Texas associate us with being a rural state, in actuality, we are more of an urban state than anything. What that means is people moving to cities, basically. And that's happened over the last, well, really 70 years. At the beginning of the 20th century, rural America was 80% of the population, but that has changed. So today, 85% of the state's population is urban. The four most populous counties are these counties: Harris, Tarrant. Harris is right here, I'm sorry. Dallas and Tarrant. And I think San Antonio, which is Bexar County. And they have a combined population of almost 11 million people. That's more than a third of the entire state's population. Most of the population is within this triangle here between Bexar County, Dallas, and Harris. So it's in this golden triangle, they sometimes call it. In the 40s, the Census Bureau began to define geographical units as standard metropolitan areas for the gathering of statistics. And they're called nowadays metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs for short. And these comprise one or more counties, and there are 25 of these Texas metro areas, and they're listed on the map here. The biggest are these two: Houston, Baytown, Sugar Land, Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington. Laredo is one of these 25 metropolitan statistical areas. We don't need to go over this. Now, suburbanization between 1980 and the present, Texas suburbs, relatively small cities, usually outside the boundaries of a central city, experienced explosive growth, and this spread into the rural areas. This process is called suburbanization, and this also was marked by racial segregation. So the Anglos in more affluent suburbs and historically minority groups in the inner cities and less affluent suburbs. That was kind of the general pattern of suburbanization. There were some government policies, I think mentioned even in the video, where people like Woodrow Wilson in the federal government would encourage the use of what they call redlining. That would be restricting lending. The federal government would only lend in low-income neighborhoods. And because historical minority groups are disproportionately included in these lower socioeconomic groups, this practice barred lending to many minority borrowers. So a lot of restrictions were used in this redlining policy. Another thing that they've used is so-called urban renewal. The federal government would create these projects to isolate and sometimes just eliminate basically minority neighborhoods. Another one was exclusionary zoning, racial covenants that would prevent minorities from renting or buying in more affluent neighborhoods, so that they would uh, have an area that was designated. Okay, the certain populations could move into these areas: whites, blacks, Hispanics. There were also what they call racial covenants, which allowed people to put into the contracts that the premises herein described shall never be sold to any person except of the Caucasian race, for instance. This would be an example of a racial covenant. Now, all of these things went away in the last 50 years, basically. But a new thing we've seen is gentrification. And gentrification is when middle class, affluent people move back into inner cities and they buy up property to build homes and businesses. And we've seen this in our own city. So, for example, if you look at, if I was to show you some of that in our own city of Laredo, I can show you that. City of Laredo. Hmm. Let's see if this works. No, this just goes to the government channel. Hmm. Well, what I wanted to show you was, oh, I know, maybe this will help. I don't know if it's not MapQuest. Maybe it's this one, satellite map. I guess I'd have to download this, but oh, that's what I should type up. City of Laredo satellite map. Google Maps. I guess we start in New York City. Could start with searching Laredo, Texas. See if it goes to that. No, I have to install it free. It's not working out. Well, let me pause it for a moment. Um, map of Laredo. Well, maybe this will give me something. It's not working. Well, let me pause the. Well, anyway, let's go back to the screen share and take a look at the map, and I'll show you what gentrification is. So this is downtown Laredo here on the satellite map. Here's the main campus of Laredo. Here's the Kazin Student Center. If you're familiar with LC, here's the Consulate General of Mexico, the Webb County tax assessor, the Webb County Jail. But let's get close up and take a look. Let's go down and into the city, and I'll show you what gentrification looks like. So if you're downtown Laredo along, let's say, Main Avenue, and here's Matamoros Street, which goes east to west this way. You can see that you have a nice park, and you'll have houses here. And many of these were built in the 40s or 50s. Well, what has happened is, and we can move forward on the street, is a lot of these houses have been bought by people and refurbished and brought up to date. Here's a church, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and there's a school over there. Let's try to find some good examples. Well, here's a great example coming up on our left here. So here's perhaps an older house, but it's been redone by someone who's probably bought it and put a little bit of money into the landscaping, maybe updated the fencing and so forth. You can find better examples if you go down in Laredo. Here's a Ice Mountain truck in front of probably an old house, but now they're businesses. So people are coming in, and like it says in the PowerPoints, they're gentrifying it. What they're doing is they're moving in, investing in property, and setting up new businesses. Let me show you maybe a couple more examples. Now here be maybe another one on the corner. See, this is looks like Davis and Houston. So you have a nice house. Looks like a brand new roof and a new paint job. So somebody's been doing some keep into the houses in this area, which has a positive effect. Now the negative effect is, let's say a lower income person can't afford to keep up with the taxes, and so they'll have to sell their houses usually. This has been going on in Laredo. You can see here, this is a nice house. Somebody's fixed that one up. This has been going on in a small measure here, just in Laredo. Okay, well, let's go back to the PowerPoint, move on. As you know, I mentioned that the urban population is 85. Well, the rural population is 14 to 15%. And we can see over the last 150 years, people have started to move in to the counties, the urban counties, since especially after World War I. So you can see most people were farmers working on farms, and then after 1900, people started moving in to the cities, and this sped up during the subsequent decades. And then in the 80s, you can see this rapid increase. And then suburbanization, people moving out into the areas, the small towns surrounding these big areas. It made those counties dark green, which means a more condensed population, higher density. But nevertheless, you had plenty of people still in the rural areas. The smallest county being uh, Loving County with 112 people. Uh, Now, a lot of people have been moving back out into these areas because of fracking and the Eagle Ford Shale. In fact, Cotulla is mentioned on page 19. It became the hotel capital of the Eagle Ford Shale. Between 2008 and 2012, their local sales tax, which is what they depend on for their services, rose from 400,000 to 3 million. Okay, now let's go into the regions of Texas and take a look at that. So these are the regions of Texas as outlined in your book. Um, you can see that the West Texas Plains is up in the north part of the state. And of course, you have the border areas right along here. Number 2. Number 3, you have the Central Texas area. Number 4, North Texas. Number 5, the East Texas Piney Woods area, and then the Gulf Coast, which really actually extends down to Brownsville. Okay. Well, briefly, let's go through these. The West Texas Plains is dominated by these cities. They get a lot of water from the Ogallala Aquifer. That's a huge water area underneath that provides water to all the crops grown there. We'll look at some maps and show you those crops. But it is continually being depleted, and it is environmentally sensitive aquifer. That's a large underground deposit of water. So we're trying to be careful about managing that water that's in this water-bearing rock formations. That'll be crucial to the region's future. And they do a lot of also sheep and wool gathering, and of course oil and related industries in the Midland Odessa area out here. And traditionally it's been more Midwestern in orientation and grew lots of wheat. They still do. Rodeos are very popular. Here's a map showing you that aquifer in blue up here, that major aquifer. Ogallala is a term to refer to a native Indian tribe of Sioux, I believe. And here's the main crops grown in that area. You can see wheat is grown in abundance in this area, upwards of 50 to 75,000 acres in counties like Deaf Smith and Palmer, Castro, 25 to 50,000 in Hartley and Moore. Corn, of course, is also grown, quite a bit of that. And Dallam County, over 100,000 acres of corn is grown there. Sherman, Hartley, Moore, huge corn growing counties in that area. The sheep, you can also see that's in more southwest Texas here in this area, like Tom Green County, Crockett County, even the border region, Val Verde, Crockett, you get 100 to 125,000 head of sheep. So, and they ship it all up to San Angelo, the city of San Angelo, and it's distributed to manufacturing and making clothes. And all of these areas in West Texas also have large numbers of herds, 50 to 75,000 sheep. Now that's region number 1. Region number 2, of course, is the border region. dominated by things like the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is an agreement between, well, it's no longer in effect. It was an agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and it was designed to expand free trade. It's been replaced by the USMCA, United States Mexico Canada Agreement, signed by Trump this summer. Mexican president came up, I think last month, AMLO, to sign it. But it's supposed to reduce and eliminate tariffs over a certain time period. It's similar to the North American Free Trade Agreement. I don't know what impact it'll have on the maquilas or the maquiladoras. Those are those businesses on the other side that take advantage of the low labor costs in Mexico and the low regulations. Spanish is widely spoken, as you know, in many homes as primary language. Roman Catholic Church is dominant, but again, it's not practiced as more, or it's not. There's not that much attendance as much as there is maybe practice at the home. The vegetable and citrus production is very big, and it's a very large Democratic Party base, and so this area votes traditionally Democrat. Although there are some areas that are Republican, like the Del Rio area over here in this area. The largest city, in fact, on the entire border of the United States and Mexico is El Paso, right here. It's around 800,000 people live in El Paso. Of course, livestock ranching culture dominates South Texas, Southwest Texas, along the border. There still is the Patron system that still kind of lingers. Okay, moving on to Central Texas, the third area. This was settled mainly by the European immigrants from areas like Germany and Czechoslovakia, Poland and Hungary, these kinds of areas. If I could show you an area, maybe I could show you an area. Okay, well, let's go back to Google Earth, and here's Laredo. Moving out. There's Texas, there's San Antonio. Let's leave our country behind and circle the globe in our imaginary rocket ship. Well, let's share the screen with you. There we go. Florida Panhandle. Flying over the Pacific Ocean, we see Bermuda, the islands of Bermuda. Then we get into the Azores, the islands off the coast of Africa, North Africa. There we see the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica. And we get into the Central European nations I mentioned that the settlers came from. And these are countries like Czechoslovakia, which is this country here, Germany, Poland. This area used to be called, this area in here used to be called Prussia, Austria, Hungary. So a lot of these countries, their peoples came over to Texas for land and settled in the area that we know as the Texas Hill Country. Okay. Well, let's see. Anything else on this? Predominantly Lutheran and Roman Catholic and some Methodists in this area. Very socially conservative and traditionally Republican. The most consistent Republican voting area of the state. Now there is exceptions like in the Austin area that's nowadays gone completely to the left. Now they vote Democrat. Up until the 90s, they were competitive, but nowadays Austin, Travis County is completely Democrat. It is a microcosm of Texas culture because you get people from all regions going to university and engaged in politics and so on. UT, of course, TAMIU, are both in this area. two of the largest universities in the United States. This area did elect the first Republican congressman back in the 20s by the name of Harry Wurzbach. Some major parts of the freeway are named the Wurzbach Freeway and so on up there. Okay, next up, this map just shows you that early German element. Each dot represents 100 persons. All of these areas were settled by these German, Austrian, Czech peoples by 1850, 5 years after we became a state. Galveston was also primarily occupied by the German immigrants. Now, North Texas is mainly your metroplex area of Dallas-Fort Worth and the suburban areas like in Denton County and cities like Plano, Arlington, Irving. These are all right there in this area. Originally they were suburbs, but now they're major cities within this metroplex area. So it has elements of East and West Texas. And originally Dallas, of course, was a rail center, and Fort Worth was where the meat was made and then processed and sent east and north to the hungry cities. They do have restored stockyards and rodeo grounds and weekend rodeos. It's now a big defense, aerospace, banking, commercial center, as you all know. My family live up in that area. Much of my family live in that area in the suburbs, but they will commute into the cities to work. Many of the people came from the Frost Belt, those cities in the Northeast. Let me switch gears on you again and show you what I mean. If we fly back to the United States, these are the cities that I'm talking about, or the states. All of these states up here in the Northeast, like Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. These are so-called Frost Belt states because it gets cold in the winter, obviously. But many of the people would move from these states. Like my relatives came from Ohio. They lived in southern Ohio and West Virginia. So these areas would get cold, and they moved to Texas. Okay. There we are back home in our beloved state and back in our beloved city. There we go. Okay. All righty. Well, let's go back. Let's go quickly through this. Almost finished for today. And this map just shows you the concentration of wealth in terms of total bank assets in certain counties, like the Metroplex counties up north, in Dallas, Tarrant County, also Denton and Collin County, and Harris County, Bexar County. Webb County also has a large number of bank deposits because of the influx from Mexico and people depositing their banks in banks like IBC. East Texas, number 5, is an extension of the Old South and has a considerable black population. It's dominated by cities listed here. Has banking, real estate, agriculture, lumber milling, and so forth. A lot of young people immigrate to Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston. It's mainly traditionally Protestant and typically does vote Republican, although there are small Democratic voting areas in the cities. Last is the Gulf Coast, of course, dominated by Houston and the oil industry and wealth from all of these areas. And it has a lot of immigration from the Asian continent. And it is politically competitive between the two major parties. All right, moving on. Now the fourth section sets off with the description of the industries that form the historical basis for the Texas economy and how it's diversified in the last 40, 50 years. And what are the implications for the politics? Well, much of our early history was dominated by these four things: cattle, cotton, timber, oil, and gas. They're still huge. We are the leader in cattle production. Number two would be Nebraska, of all places. And we're also leading in sheep, goats, wool, and mohair. We also lead the country in exported cotton. Timber, believe it or not, we do extract a lot of timber from East Texas. And we are impacted by droughts, and we do have some wildfires, although not as many as the far west, like California, Oregon, Washington. Oil and gas, of course, we account for 40% of total oil production, 30% of natural gas. That's probably higher. This book was written 5 years ago, so it's probably around 50%. And of course, that has an impact on national politics. People in Texas are going to vote for people that support expansion of our gas and oil production. That tends to be more of what Trump supports. So many people associated with his industry would probably support uh, President Trump. New emphasis, though, is on alternative energy in Texas. Here's a map showing you the number of cattle. You can see where it's concentrated in these areas, but it's all over the state. Dairy cattle up in these areas. Cotton up here in West Texas, getting that water from the Ogallala Aquifer. Lumber industry, we've got hardwood, veneer mills, chip mills, plywood mills, state forests, small sawmills, large sawmills. They're just all over this area. It's hard to believe, but we have these huge forests where the lumber industry is huge. Now, oil and gas map here shows you the oil and gas industry by way of this map here. You can see this is a map as of 05, but it's pretty accurate, showing you the Permian Basin and the Eagle Ford Shale, showing you the concentrations of gas in red here. You can see that. We have tons of these in Zapata and Webb County, of course. Okay. And down here on the left corner, you can see how by 2005, you can see the production of gas has gone just straight up. It's probably way up here by now. And oil also is probably back up there as well. The new economic directions include such things as fracking. That's been a big thing in the last 15, 20 years. There's a lot of environmental and health concerns that's accompanied this recovery method. You can see by the slide what had happened. Basically, I'm not a science expert, but basically you inject something into this area, it expands and then cracks it, and then they extract the minerals from it. Now this brings up people who have concerns about, let's switch to alternative fuels. As of right now, only 1% of our total energy supply is really renewables. It's risen to 10%, but it was reduced further down by 2016 to only 2.5%. So most high-tech jobs are in manufacturing: Motorola, Dell, Hewlett Packard, Texas Instruments. And that employment is centered in the state's major cities. We do lead the nation in energy production capacity from wind farms, and we continue to develop our solar energy potential. But I'm not sure that's all it's cracked up to be. Let's take a look at something that might address some of those concerns. This video I found, which might be helpful. Can we rely on wind and solar? Okay. This guy's going to speak on that. Oops.
And a lot of wind. They're free, they're clean, no CO2 emissions. So what's the problem? Why do solar and wind combined provide less than 2% of the world's energy? To answer these questions, we need to understand what makes energy, or anything else for that matter, cheap and plentiful. For something to be cheap and plentiful, every part of the process to produce it, including every input that goes into it, must be cheap and plentiful. Yes, the sun is free. Yes, wind is free. But the process of turning sunlight and wind into usable energy on a mass scale is far from free. In fact, compared to the other sources of energy, fossil fuels, nuclear power, and hydroelectric power, solar and wind power are very expensive. The basic problem is that sunlight and wind as energy sources are both weak, the more technical term is dilute, and unreliable, the more technical term is intermittent. It takes a lot of resources to collect and concentrate them, and even more resources to make them available on demand. These are called the diluteness problem and the intermittency problem. The diluteness problem is that, unlike coal or oil, the sun and the wind don't deliver concentrated energy, which means you need a lot of additional materials to produce a unit of energy. For solar power, such materials can include highly purified silicon, phosphorus, boron, and a dozen other complex compounds like titanium dioxide. All these materials have to be mined, refined, and/or manufactured in order to make solar panels. Those industrial processes take a lot of energy. For wind, needed materials include high-performance compounds for turbine blades and the rare earth metal neodymium for lightweight specialty magnets, as well as the steel and concrete necessary to build structures, thousands of them as tall as skyscrapers. And as big a problem as diluteness is, it's nothing compared to the intermittency problem. This isn't exactly a newsflash, but the sun doesn't shine all the time, and the wind doesn't blow all the time. The only way for solar and wind to be truly useful would be if we could store them, so that they would be available when we needed them. You can store oil in a tank. Where do you store solar or wind energy? No such mass storage system exists, which is why in the entire world, there is not one real or proposed independent freestanding solar or wind power plant. All of them require backup. And guess what the go-to backup is? Fossil fuel. Here's what solar and wind electricity look like in Germany, which is the world's leader in renewables. The word erratic leaps to mind. Wind is constantly varying, sometimes disappearing completely. And solar produces little in the winter months when Germany most needs energy. Therefore, some reliable source of energy is needed to do the heavy lifting. In Germany's case, that energy is coal. So, while Germany has spent tens of billions of dollars to subsidize solar panels and windmills, fossil fuel use in that nation has not decreased, it's increased. And less than 10% of their total energy is generated by solar and wind. Furthermore, switching back and forth between solar and wind and coal to maintain a steady flow of energy is costly. Utility bills for the average German have gone up so dramatically that energy poverty has become a popular term to describe those who cannot pay or who can barely pay their electricity bills. If those bills one day go down, the reason will not be more solar and wind energy, but lower oil and coal prices. There's no free lunch, and there's no free energy. And that very much includes the highly expensive energy from the sun and the wind. I'm Alex Epstein, of the Center for Industrial Progress for Prager University.
To subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Okay. All right, let's go back, take a look at our presentation here quickly. So the new economic directions include such things as alternative energies, but they can't always be relied upon. There's also the services. Now that employs 1/4 of all Texans. I'm a servant. I'm a public school teacher, so the benefits pay is lower than some of the other sectors. Health services, many of you are going into that, nursing and other fields. That has to be probably the fastest growing in the state of Texas. Agriculture, even though that's a small percent of people, 1 to 2%, that is number two. We do rank second in the United States. Number of farms and ranches has decreased. Trade, many of you might be in trade or know somebody in trade, and you're affected by the upcoming USMC. Some of the new challenges, those 5 challenges we talked about, include such things as immigration. What do we do with the undocumented immigrants, the illegal aliens? We estimate the numbers around 1.7 million in the state of Texas. They are employed in construction, agriculture, hospitality, tourism. We've built fences. We've passed the DREAM Act here in Texas. We do have more boat patrols. We have the wall going up. The DREAM Act was unconstitutional, but what to do about the 8 million illegals and the 800,000 dreamers is a big question right now. Right now, basically, the undocumented are arrested, detained, expelled from the country. Another big problem would be water. We have set up a Texas Water Board, and this is a priority issue. Education is another problem. We're one of the lower spending on students, and college educators complain many students are poorly educated, poorly prepared, I should say, and there is a teacher shortage. And finally, the poverty and social programs. We have a lot of people living in poverty, 30,000 people homeless. We have a high percentage of uninsured residents. And we don't want to use the federal Medicaid expansion under Obamacare, because then we have to adopt all the requirements. And then once the federal money goes away, we have to increase our taxes. And most Texans don't want to do that. So to conclude, we have a lot of changing demographic, economic, social, and environmental conditions. They're changing. Diversity of our population, demographically, economically, geographically, is changing. So I would study the chapter summaries for the upcoming test on chapter 1. That might be helpful. Take a look at the objectives and understand the basic how our culture has shaped our Texas politics, moralistic, individualistic, traditionalistic, and then describe the relationship between our social history and the political characteristics, how the size, how the movement of populations to the urban centers has affected policies, and then take a look at those historic industries, cattle, cotton, timber, and the oil, and then the new diverse ones, the biotechnology and the wind and solar and the services and agriculture, and then some of these policy challenges that we need to respond to: immigration, water, poverty, education, so on. Also, make sure you study the key terms. So when you're taking a look at the what do you call it? The class. When you're in the class, go to the modules, and let's bring this up here. go to this is a good place to start. Go to the chapter 1 objective summary outline and key terms. So you can open that. That'll open up this Word document. And let's take a look at this together. This gives you an idea of the kind of the overall learning objectives and the summary. So this is a good summary of the chapter. And it gives you kind of an outline you can follow if you want to use it during lectures or just take a look at it. That's great. Write notes off to the side if you want, or just include things. And here are the key terms. So study these terms: African American, Anglo, Asian, biotech, eminent domain, exclusionary zoning, gentrification, government, Jim Crow laws, Latino, because these will be things that will be on the test on Saturday. So make sure you take that test. You need to have your Respondus Lockdown browser loaded to take that test, okay? So that'll conclude, I think, chapter 1. And next week we'll go over chapter 2, which is on federalism and the Texas Constitution. So let me know. I hope I try to, this is a learning process for me, getting used to the Zoom. So if you have any questions or comments, let me know. If you want me to focus on more or something, let me know. I'll be glad to do that. Just keep in touch. Okay. Thank you very much.